Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to deconstruct a really pivotal piece of legislation in India's journey to independence, the Government of India Act of 1919. Now, if you're a UPSC aspirant, you already know this is a must-know topic. It's complicated, it's full of contradictions, and it completely changed the political game. So, let's just dive right in.
All right, here's our roadmap. First, we'll set the scene, looking at the major events that really forced the British to act. Then, we'll get into the details, the big declaration of intent, and the changes it triggered. And finally, we'll take a step back and really assess what this act meant on the ground. Let's get started.
You know, to really get a handle on the 1919 Act, we've got to understand why it happened. This wasn't just some random law passed out of the blue. No, it was a direct response to a perfect storm of events. A world war, massive political pressure at home, and a growing, unified call for self-rule in India.
Okay, look at this timeline. You can literally see the pressure building, step by step. It kicks off in 1914 with World War I. India's contribution is massive, and that creates a very real expectation of a political reward. Then, just 2 years later, that expectation gets a single, powerful voice thanks to the Lucknow Pact. At that point, the demands for change were just too loud for Britain to ignore.
The Lucknow Pact of 1916 was an absolute game changer. You had the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, two major political forces coming together to present a common set of demands. Things like a bigger central legislature and a 5-year term. These were specific, they were ambitious, and because they were presented by a united front, they were incredibly hard to dismiss.
So the Lucknow Pact fires this clear, unified message to Britain that India is ready for some serious change. And, well, in 1917, Britain responded. The Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, made a historic declaration that, on paper at least, was supposed to set India on a brand new course.
This August declaration was a massive turning point. And the key words here, the ones you absolutely have to remember, are responsible government. That phrase was everything. It marked a huge shift. For the very first time, the British weren't just talking about letting more Indians associate with the administration. They were stating that a form of democratic accountability was the actual goal.
So, what does responsible government actually mean? Well, think about it like this. It's a system where the people running the country, the executive, are ultimately answerable to the elected legislature and through them to the people themselves, not just to their bosses back in London. It was a huge promise, but what would it look like in practice? That was the big question.
All right, so the 1919 Act gets to work, and it starts right at the very top. It made some pretty big changes to the central administration, both for the Secretary of State in London and for the Viceroy's own council right there in Delhi. Let's break those down.
Now, this is a really interesting one. For decades, Indian leaders had a major gripe. Why was India paying the salary of a British cabinet minister from its own revenues? The 1919 Act finally addressed this, moving the cost to the British budget. But, and it's a big but, they created a new office, the High Commissioner for India. And guess who paid for that? Yep, Indian revenues. A classic political two-step.
Now let's talk about the Viceroy's Executive Council. This was the nerve center of British rule in India, the absolute highest executive authority. And before 1919, this incredibly powerful group was almost entirely British. Out of 6 members, there was just one lone Indian member.
And then, boom, the 1919 Act comes along and triples that number from 1 to 3. Now, this was a really significant step. For the first time, you were going to have multiple Indian voices right there at the highest level of government, helping to shape policy from the inside.
Okay, so we've looked at the changes at the top. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the lawmaking body, the central legislature. The 1919 Act completely overhauled this thing, introducing a new structure that would actually influence Indian Parliament for years and years to come. The biggest change was the introduction of bicameralism. Basically, they scrapped the old single-chamber council and replaced it with a 2-house system, an upper house and a lower house. The idea was to create a more mature system, kind of like the one they had back in Britain, with more checks and balances.
So, let's look at this new structure. You had the Legislative Assembly as the lower house and the Council of State as the upper house. Now notice the term length for the Council of State, 5 years. That's not a random number. That was one of the specific demands made way back in the 1916 Lucknow Pact. So they were listening. To a point. But, and this is a huge but, While the act was introducing all these seemingly modern structures, it was also digging in its heels on a deeply controversial policy: separate electorates. Instead of creating a more unified voting system, they actually doubled down on communal representation, which would have enormous consequences down the line.
And just look at how far they expanded this policy. It wasn't just about reaffirming it for Muslims. They extended it to Sikhs, Europeans, Anglo-Indians, and Indian Christians. This system, where specific seats were reserved for communities and only members of that community could vote for them, was seen by many as a textbook divide-and-rule tactic. It literally wrote division into the political DNA of the country.
Okay, so we've gone through all the details, the context, the key changes, the principles. But the big question is, what did it all add up to? Was this really a step towards self-rule, or was it just a fancier, more sophisticated cage?
And this really gets to the heart of it. Indian leaders were demanding a real move towards self-government, or Swaraj. What they got was more participation and a more complex system, sure, but the real power, especially over things like the budget, defense, foreign affairs, that stayed firmly in British hands. The Viceroys still had the final say, the ultimate veto.
So if you're studying for exams, these are the key takeaways. The 1919 Act was a total mixed bag. On the one hand, yes, it put the idea of responsible government on the table and created new ways for Indians to participate. But on the other hand, it kept real power with the British and deepened communal divisions. It gave the appearance of progress while making sure the core of imperial control stayed right where it was. So, in the end, we're left with this huge question. The Government of India Act of 1919 was, without a doubt, a step forward from what existed before. But was it a genuine step on the path towards an independent India? Or was it actually a very clever and calculated move to slow that journey down, to manage and contain the freedom struggle? That's the essential question we have to grapple with.